Let's go there. Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh issued a stern denial last night to a second allegation of sexual misconduct, this time as a college student. The New Yorker magazine reports that Senate Democrats are investigating a claim from Deborah Ramirez, who says Kavanaugh pulled down his pants and exposed himself to her during their freshman year at Yale University. In the last week, three sources familiar with the accusation told NBC about Ramirez's claim. Ramirez, 53, is the same age as Kavanaugh, and they both graduated from the university in 1987. She referred to NBC to her lawyer, who did not respond to her request for comment. Last night's report says that in her initial conversations with The New Yorker, she was reluctant to characterize Kavanaugh's role in the alleged incident with certainty. Quoting from the article, which includes graphic details, after 6 days of carefully assessing her memories and consulting with her attorney, Ramirez says that she felt confident enough of her recollections to say that she remembers Kavanaugh had exposed himself at a drunken dormitory party, thrust his penis into her face, and caused her to touch it without her consent as she pushed him away. She is calling for the FBI to investigate. The New York Times reports they interviewed several dozen people over the past week in an attempt to corroborate Ramirez's story and could find no one with firsthand knowledge. The White House distributed Kavanaugh's response, quote, "This alleged event from 35 years ago did not happen. The people who knew me then know that this did not happen and have said so. This is a smear, plain and simple."
Mike Barnacle, my God, this has become such an absolute mess. And I'm sure you spoke to friends this weekend, like I spoke to friends this weekend. And we always hear about how tribal everything is. What was remarkable was the complaints and the criticisms were a stream of consciousness. And one moment they were attacking Republicans for accusing this woman of being, or these two women of being liars, fabulists, politically motivated. The next, they were expressing their concerns about all those on the other side that have already convicted Kavanaugh as an accused rapist, or somebody I saw this weekend was talking about him being a serial sexual predator. We've got alcohol-altered memories over 3 decades. We do have
serious allegations.
Serious allegations, and it seems to me that both sides at this point should want the FBI to come in and investigate.
Oh, absolutely.
We are not going, nobody knows what happened. It needs to be pieced together. Even those who are making the allegations, again, their memories are altered over 30 years, and alcohol was involved, I believe, in both cases. Why wouldn't Republicans want the FBI to investigate if they think their man's innocent?
Well, Joe, there is so much going on in this story that we could spend the rest of the morning and all day today and tomorrow talking about it. But the first point is the one that you just raised. Given the extraordinary nature of the circumstances surrounding this, the charges by Dr. Ford, the charges as leveled in New Yorker magazine by Mr. Ramirez, I mean, it is insane not to pump the brakes on this process, to take a breather, to have the FBI investigate the background as well as they can. I mean, this happened years ago, according to both women. But just to take a look at it afresh. And the other aspect of the story, and there are so many, we began this program this morning talking about polls. Well, what has happened within the Supreme Court story is now a two-track story. It's got to affect certain congressional candidacies in certain districts around the country. Are you for Judge Kavanaugh or not? That's got to be a legitimate question now in many campaigns. And the other aspect of it that is truly dangerous, truly threatening, is the incredible hyper-partisanship now surrounding surrounding the Supreme Court of the United States. These are lifetime appointments. You're supposed to look at the law as a neutral observer and decide on the basis of the law, not partisanship. And yet partisanship has always been there in the Supreme Court, but the hyper-partisanship today is truly, truly dangerous.
It really is. No, on both sides. I did myself a favor this weekend and got off Twitter as much as I could, because, my God, there are so many on the left and some former Republicans from the right just making terrible accusations about Judge Kavanaugh. One saying that he's a serial sexual predator. And then on the right, we have some people that you and I know who have spent the last 2 weeks nonstop calling these women liars. The partisanship is so out of control when none of us really know what happened on those 2 nights.
Right. Twitter doesn't really foster an environment of sobriety. It kind of rewards you going to the level 11. So I'm not right. Exactly surprised by that reaction. But as we said over the course of this segment, this story in the New Yorker questions itself on several occasions. Can't put Brett Kavanaugh in this room. Notes that the story is, as alleged, is something that the allegations were made after 6 days of interrogating her own memories with the help of her attorney, which is itself something that's a little suspicious, considering that Ramirez, according to the New York Times, told her friends that she wasn't sure whether Brett Kavanaugh was there or not. People who are saying that the FBI probably has a role in this, I think, are probably correct. They should say that the president should ask the FBI to beef up these background investigations, the 6 of which that Judge Kavanaugh underwent over the course of his many confirmations. But the FBI is not the super serious police. They have a jurisdiction. They can't just investigate everything because somebody says, look, my memory's a little foggy here. I'd really like the FBI to step in and help beef it up. That's not how this works. Those who are saying that we need more information here are correct, but anybody who's leaping to conclusions is doing so, I think, for politically motivated reasons. As you said, we don't have enough information to draw a conclusion about either of these incidents.
Well, what we have are 2 very serious accusations, and we have 2 sides to a story that we're trying to cover. And Casey Hunt, I think, is not just Twitter, it's the media that's in a very serious position right now. And if you watch, 24-hour coverage of this story, you may see 4 or 5 analysts in a row being brought on to convict Judge Kavanaugh. There's a need for balance here, because the more that you put one side on, or if you have a focus group with Republican operatives in it, pushing the other side of the story, there are allegations here. They are not proven. There is the law, and there is a push for an investigation. These are the parts that we need to report. But if we're not careful, if the media as a whole is not careful covering this story, we're feeding into that very negative narrative that President Trump himself really drums up in his base, and that is fake news. Right now, all we have are 2 serious accusations that are not proven. Is that fair? Am I correct?
The bar is always high for the media to get the story right. But in a case like this, where there is so much at stake, there are so many strong emotions, and frankly, the stakes are so incredibly high. We all have a duty to the American people, to the viewers, to the readers that we are all serving every day, to make sure that we are getting it right first and foremost, and that also, yes, that there is a fairness being applied across the board. I think, politically speaking, when you start to dig into that, Democrats are more concerned about fairness towards Dr. Ford and Ms. Ramirez in this case, and Republicans to Judge Kavanaugh. And, I was talking to one source of mine who used to work on these nominations inside the Senate Judiciary Committee, and he's a Republican, but he was saying that, we have become so polarized and tribal as a country. We shouldn't. What party you're a member of should not dictate whether you believe Judge Kavanaugh or you believe Dr. Ford. We should be able to listen to what both of them have to say. They are saying opposite things, essentially, and think through it and come to a logical conclusion. But that is not how this is playing out. It's playing out as you are digging in your tribal camp on one side or the other. And there are a handful of people in the middle that are the ones that really matter. And they are those critical senators that are going to have to vote on this. Bob Corker, Jeff Flake, Susan Collins, and Lisa Murkowski. And they're all going to have to decide for themselves. I mean, we've reached a point where this is going to be a historical moment in the context of, our society, especially in the context of the United States Senate. And John Meacham said to me last night, his test for a lot of these political figures is, okay, when people look at the oil painting on the wall, what do they think of when they see you? And these critical senators have a decision to make that's of that magnitude when it comes to Judge Kavanaugh. And I think to circle back to Mike Barnichel's point, there are legitimate questions about why does he need to be, potentially confirmed by the end of the week, which is what Republicans have been talking about.
Well, and that is a great question. It seems to me for Republicans, the deadline obviously would be before the November elections. The only reason you would try to rush a vote is because you were afraid more information was going to be coming out. We saw that with Mitch McConnell last week saying, we're going to steamroll this over. Don't worry about it. Let's get this done as quickly as possible. And then this weekend, another accusation came out. There are reports that possibly a third accusation, according to Avenatti, a third accusation is going to come out. That doesn't mean that any of them are factually accurate. We don't know. It could be that there's one accusation piled on top of another accusation, piled on top of another accusation. By the way, just because there are 3, 5, 10 accusations does not mean that any of them are accurate, but does mean they need to be investigated. These women that are coming forward at a great personal price to themselves. And I personally find it hard to believe that anyone would put themselves on the political firing line unless they believed that something terrible happened to them 3 decades ago. But again, what I believe, what Mika believes, what you believe really doesn't change the facts. I mean, the facts will be determined by an investigation. And Mike, I have absolutely no idea why the Republicans can't do exactly what you just said, pump the brakes, investigate this for a couple of more weeks, and if they are correct and these women are lying, then Judge Kavanaugh will be in great shape. And if it's an FBI investigation, these women will be going to jail. So the question is, what are Republicans afraid of if the truth is on their side?
Joe, you just raised maybe one of the most critical aspects of this entire story, and it is the human nature aspect. So now we are surrounded with allegations leveled against Judge Kavanaugh from 2 women, Dr. Ford and Ms. Ramirez. Given how we live today, given the culture around us, we're all familiar with it, with social media, you would have to be mentally ill to inject yourself into this argument and to fabricate or lie about these things. You would have to be totally mentally ill because you've ruined a huge part of your life immediately. You've ruined it.
Yeah, you've ruined your life. You've ruined other people's life. You've set yourself up to be absolutely ripped to shreds in the national media. So it doesn't really make an awful lot of sense. But again, let's get the facts. Let's get the facts to the American people. Let the senators and the people that they represent make the decisions. Hey, Steve, Casey was, or maybe it was me, I think Mika was talking about that focus group. I hate to mention another network, but that CNN focus group where you had these 5, 6 women saying, oh, we're behind Judge Kavanaugh. It ended up they were all Republican operatives. Another example of how the press has to do a better job. This is important. You can't say, oh, we just have 6 random women here, or 5 or 6, and then put them in front of a camera. Then they end up being all Republican operatives or former Republican candidates.
Well, obviously, that's not a great example of journalism at its finest, but I do look. I think a couple things. We've talked about the question of whether these women are telling the truth or not. We haven't really talked about the question of what is the right standard by which the Senate Judiciary Committee should judge. Obviously, in a criminal situation, it's beyond a reasonable doubt. In a civil situation, it's a preponderance of the evidence. What is the standard here once we know whatever facts we're going to know? And by the way, I think you could send the FBI out there to investigate for a month. You've had a whole bunch of investigative reporters out there. It's very possible they're going to come back and we're going to be essentially in the same place we're in, with one woman who's got a very specific remembrance, one woman maybe a little less certain, a lot of doubt around the whole situation. And how are we to judge? What is supposed to be the standard by which we decide whether this guy should be on the Supreme Court? The only thing I'd say, and this is not in my mind, disqualifying, but it is interesting as we learn more about Judge Kavanaugh's character. I was in college a few years before that, and there were groups of people that sort of followed different practices. And I'm not saying I was in the Boy Scouts, but there were groups on these campuses that were into heavy drinking, were into heavy partying, and in some cases, I'm not saying in Kavanaugh's case, were into doing things with women that I think we would regard as inappropriate by any standard today. And I think some of that has come fairly clearly out, that he was part of that part of the Yale campus.
Can we lean on that evidentiary standard notion there for a minute? As you said, there's, you know, beyond a reasonable doubt is an inappropriate standard for something like this. This isn't a courtroom. This is public opinion. And those who have said that the burden is on this justice to prove himself a competent justice are correct. But we're not talking about how you judge cases here, or your legal philosophy. We're talking about potentially criminal allegations. And even if we use a preponderance evidence standard, which is a pretty low standard, we don't meet that threshold. We don't have enough people who are corroborating this story. All the named witnesses in the Ramirez story say that this did not happen. All the named witnesses in the Ford story cannot corroborate that story. I don't know what the FBI is supposed to turn up if the press is already doing this background work and cannot find anybody to corroborate these stories, both of them.
Well, and at the end of the day, Miko, I guess this really is something that the senators are going to be focusing on. What is the standard? And let me tell you, unfortunately, what the standard is going to be even before we see the hearing.
Yeah.
Who presents best? Who is the most believable? Who nods their head at the appropriate time? Who doesn't sort of have nervous flop sweat? Who is best on television? That's what this has come down to. It's going to be a gut instinct. Who do you believe? And of course, Mike Barnicle will remember. Anybody reading history of the 1960s election will remember that people that were driving in a car listening to the Nixon-Kennedy debate on the radio thought that Nixon just absolutely blew John Kennedy away politically, rhetorically. Those who were listening, who were watching it on TV, thought Kennedy blew Nixon away just visually and the way he presented. Unfortunately, Mika, we're not going to be talking about a preponderance of the evidence. We're not going to be talking about any standards that we carry in courtrooms or in civil or criminal cases. It's going to be who is the most convincing on television. And that's unfortunately no way to pick a Supreme Court justice. Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.